All right, welcome, Scott. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and have a discussion with me. As you know, my name is Dr. Joe Long, and I'm with the Joint Special Operations University. And it's my distinct pleasure today to have an opportunity to sit with you and have a discussion about a particular role that you played just about 2 decades ago that we've been talking about. So I'd like to offer an opportunity for you to say some introductory words and talk a little bit about what you experienced 2 decades ago.
Well, thank you very much. Once again, I kind of grew up here in Central Florida, and I ended up retiring out of SOCOM, and that gave me this kind of perspective of, just being an infantry sergeant to a special operator, and then finally the 4-star headquarters. So it kind of rounded out my view of the last 20 years in the war on terrorism. And I think what we'll talk about is, once again, the experiences of small teams of Green Berets that were kind of on the leading edge when 9/11 happened, and what we went through, the decision cycle, the preparation cycle, the insertion, almost the 7 phases of unconventional warfare we followed as the first few months into Afghanistan. And then we did the same thing into Iraq as well.
Excellent. And I think those are very, very exciting things. So talk to me a little bit about the preparation. So obviously 9/11 was in and of itself a surprise, but as a fellow member of the Special Forces Regiment, that's a surprise that we have been preparing for 7 decades prior to that. How prepared did you feel as a member of your detachment that day?
Well, let's step back and talk about, of course, what makes up a Green Beret A team, which is traditional 12 men, Special Forces ODA Operational Attachment Alpha. You have a captain. The captains tend to be very young on a team. If you think about a natural command cycle from a second lieutenant to a first lieutenant to a captain, it really is 3 to 4 years. Whereas you're partnered with a team sergeant, a master sergeant that's probably had 14 to 16 years in Special Forces. Right? Then you're accompanied by a warrant officer that comes from the Special Forces enlisted ranks. They are usually the executive officer and focused on human intelligence. Then you have an intel sergeant that parallels the warrant officer on intelligence activities. And then you have 2 communication sergeants, 2 weapons sergeants, 2 engineers, and 2 Special Forces medics. Now, what makes Green Berets uniquely different than all the other special operators, you have obviously special operations, direct action, special reconnaissance, foreign internal defense, unconventional warfare. The Green Berets tend to be more mountain men, right? How they're selected is quite different. Intellectually, how Green Berets are selected are different. And our exercise, the culmination exercise to become a Green Beret, is really the only exercise in Department of Defense that focuses entirely on partner guerrilla forces, that rapport building and bringing them to a capable, competent resistance force is what is the building blocks of a Green Beret. So forward a little bit more, I was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Our area of operations is the Middle East. So I had been in and out of Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, basically any of the Muslim religion ideology tear lines was our area. I spoke Persian Farsi at the time. I was trained at the Special Forces Warfare Center for Languages for Farsi, which is Iranian, but I also had to study Arabic and Swahili before missions going in and out of these areas. On 9/11, I was getting ready to go on a normal rotation in the Middle East on 1 October. And we were actually in a training exercise simulating an attack on the United States. Our sister team, Mark and Bob, they had just returned back from Uzbekistan for 7 months. They had worked with Uzbeki Spetsnaz, and they were helping them counter Al-Qaeda and the IMU as they were pushing up through Afghanistan, widening the drug trade, potentially looking for weapons of mass destruction and different WMD capabilities that were in the former Soviet Union. So we had a lot of experience in the area. So I remember vividly on that day that the intel sergeant came into our isolation facility and wrote on the board that the World Trade Center had been attacked and a plane hit it. And literally we thought it was just part of the training exercise. We had no television, nothing. Another hour later, he comes back in and says the second World Trade Center's been hit. And once again, okay, complex attack. Why the World Trade Center? We actually were putting on our exercise messages what had just happened. And it wasn't until about 4 hours later that then Colonel Mulholland came in and said, stop, this is for real. And I think just like everybody else, we went out to the mess hall and we saw it for the first time. But, that is kind of my personal story. But then to watch the mechanism of national security, the presidential Congress enacting things, all the way to a special forces team receiving its first mission was by 14 September 2001. That basically two plans, and this is as it was explained to me as a young sergeant. There was two plans that were presented. One plan was a complex Army Marine Corps invasion, overland or airborne operations, staging in the Gulf. It was proposed that it would take 6 months to gather the forces and make a contested invasion into the area. And at the time, President Bush said, I need America's response sooner. Mm-hmm. So George Tenet of the CIA had made a proposal that small teams of Green Berets and CIA agents go in ahead of a time and rekindle old relationships with the Mujahideen, because remember, 5th Group was also working with the agency in the 80s, bringing capabilities to the Mujahideen through Pakistan, whether it was air defense, it was medical capabilities. So we actually had Green Berets that had been working with the Mujahideen in the 80s. So that is the long tissue connectivity of special operations and Green Berets that are regionally aligned. And that becomes important as we talk about the conversation we move forward. So as we begin to marshal and get ready different Green Berets, you don't know what other teams are going to do. When you're in isolation, you're given a mission. What I've come to learn as I became more senior is that the commander would give the same mission to various teams. And he was like an expeditionary entrepreneur, and he would pick the best business plan, so to speak, of who he thought was more capable and competent and achieving success. He also wanted a backup in case you were lost in link-up or you were lost in insertion. He had a backup plan to go. So multiple teams began to receive various missions. We had no clue what the other teams were or where they were going and what they were doing. So that really started by the end of September, and by 19 October, two teams of Green Berets were inserted behind the lines to link up with the alpha teams of the CIA.
Fascinating. Were you familiar with any of the specific previous relationships that had been earned in the 80s? Or was that something you benefited from?
It's interesting, we had got briefed by one of the agency representatives in my Q course, right, my qualifications course. When my very first team, the medics, had went in the 80s and worked through Peshawar and inserted. So these were old lore legends, right? Now, we have done other missions, of course, in the Middle East, working with agencies and law enforcement and other partner nations. All of these were not as unconventionally focused like the stories you heard in the 80s. Now it became true. And I think part of what America didn't realize is the intelligence mechanism United States was focused on major nation state actors, Iran, the Soviet Unions, how far could bombers fly, how deep could submarines go, how much does it take to move a brigade of armor across land. And when it came to Afghanistan, there was little to no information. As a matter of fact, National Geographics were stuffed into our intel packets as an area study for us to understand.
Wow, that's interesting to think about how things were at the time.
Yeah.
Because it is unexpected. But you mentioned earlier that the 5th Special Forces Group is regionally oriented, and that you were building on some previously made relationships. Mm-hmm. So how critical do you think the aspect of those pre-existing relationships are to being able to replicate this? in any part of that area of responsibility?
I think it's a couple fold, right? It's number one, who do we know in the area, right? And we would pass it up, down, left, and right. It was actually General Dostum, right, that became a central figure that had met a congressional staffer in Turkey. As he was always lobbying for America to provide support against Al-Qaeda, you know, they felt they had won the lottery on 9/11. They knew America was going to become involved. So you had this resistance, which was loosely organized, very tribally and regionally aligned, that now knew the significance of what Al-Qaeda had just done. Remember, they had just also why did Al-Qaeda attack the Lion of Panjshir, the symbology of Massoud, right, as an organizer and unifier? Because he made the false assumption that nobody could unite the rest of the tribes.
Okay.
So that was quickly relayed to us as, okay, we had 9/11, a significant event. The world outpoured support and momentum, right? You know, now how to go into a contested, denied area and gain intelligence and information and evaluate any degree of resistance that existed 20 years ago. And that literally was the mission, right? It was open-ended. We didn't really have a way out, right? It was one way. It was really to just establish rapport, assess and evaluate, understand the terrain and the environment, gauge the standing of the Taliban, gauge the hold of Al-Qaeda within Taliban military ranks, and that was quite frankly it. And imagine, you know, that kind of mission given to, at the time, was 32-year-olds, captains and sergeants. And those are the first ones that went in behind the lines.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Massoud. Just anecdotally, over Labor Day, I had a chance to hang out with some younger Green Berets, and they were asking, because it was like right on the verge of 9/11 coming up, and Massoud's son was in the headlines doing some great things, and they were asking, who's Massoud and what role did he play? And so it's interesting that at the time he was somebody we talked about, and it was a big deal, even for me in the Q course. So what role did he play? And then let's talk about how it might be a little interesting that narrative has kind of been lost over the 2 decades.
So, you know, it's interesting you say that. After 20 years, we forget the fundamental culture of the environment we're fighting in, right? The history, you know, are we scholars of history of the environment? Massoud was in the Middle East, and especially in Afghanistan, you have personalities, you have warlords. It was just part of the culture. We had Geronimo. Was he the best fighter Indian? Was there 100 other Comanche qualified? But you remember one, right? And they become the most iconic. Massoud had this general intellectual self, and he had fought alongside a lot of these other personalities, from Atta to even bin Laden, right? And except he was seen as more neutral, right? Kind of a Godfather-esque personality that talked about hopes and aspirations for a beautiful Afghanistan, not control, not population control through religious, not military control of resources. He served as this ideological, better Afghanistan for better days person. Now his son, right, in the Middle East, and even throughout histories, when you took out a great leader, you had to take out his entire family, because they mean so much to the lineage of tribal organized people. And what you see today is Massoud's son. He is now the face of the resistance. And he is the one that will be the rally cry psychologically and media-wise of any resistance going forward, by far. Does he have the charisma of his father? Probably not.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the thing. I really would like to know more about it, because the narrative about his charisma and being able to be tribal uniting is still legendary in this time. Which brings me to another point about the idea of trying to do this kind of partner force leadership in a tribal environment.
Yeah.
Did your special forces career up to that point prepare you for that? Talk to me a little bit about your relationship with preparation and being able to lead tribes, because I think
Exactly.
tribals are important.
So, there are books, 3 Cup of Tea, some other things that talk about what salesmen tend to know, right? If you meet somebody in the beginning, you have to make a personal human connection. Then you have to talk about your grievances, my grievances. So there's this kind of formula in basic human negotiations I think military misses at times. Military is very structured. I am the commander. This is my position. I show up on time. You do what I say. There's these contractual bureaucratic relationships that do not fit when you're talking to an inspirational leader, right? Or a tribal leader or a warlord who gained his power through ruthless actions and activities. He's very savvy. So when you start to engage them, you can't say, America sent me, you talk to me, right? And I will give you things. So in the beginning, when we first linked up, which wasn't the first time we've ever linked up with a resistance force. I've done this for 10 years prior, different levels. So you exchange, right? Gifts, like a welcome gift, right? You go see a friend, you exchange a bottle. We brought various things. Some of it could have been alcohol, right? We heard that General Dostum was an alcoholic and he had a bad kidney and maybe he liked some good Russian. So you're trying to find that lever of introduction, right? There was some other items. Some of his commanders loved flashlights, right? Remember, these are very simple people. After you engage with the leadership, don't forget that you've got to make friends with their equivalent of brigade, battalion, company commanders. So you've got to appropriately spend time. I know that Mark, in the first 5 days, spent an average of 10 to 12 hours in the saddle, riding equivalent of county to county just to assemble, which is part of their ritual, right? You come into town, hear ye, we're the Americans, let's have tea. The elders would assemble, and what you would do is say, why am I here? So we told America's story. We were attacked. Our friends died in a building. It was unprovoked. It was and now you're into storytelling. Who's the demon of the story? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was Al-Qaeda. Your enemy, the Taliban, failed to turn them over. We demand justice. Now, that is what they all understood. Their enemy wasn't per se Taliban as much as the bad Taliban. They called them bad Taliban. As much as the foreign Taliban. They called Al-Qaeda foreign Taliban, which just as basically means a religious student. So we found a common thread of they attacked us. We know that they have been attacking you. Let's combine. We will bring resources to help you attack. Will you commit to this relationship? And overwhelmingly, they all said yes.
What are your thoughts on the folks you linked up with and their identity, whether it's like, we have a very strong American identity, clearly. What identity did they have, whether it was at a national level of being Afghan, tribal, somewhere in between? What did you see?
So in Afghanistan, they all see themselves, they start with their surname and their tribe, right? So their immediate hierarchy in the family. The next is their town, village location. Next is their tribal affiliation. Last, I say I'm a Green Beret. I don't say I'm a U.S. Army soldier from, you know what I mean? I don't feel I have a connectivity. I'm from the tribe of Green Berets, right? That happens to be part of the Army Special Operations. That happens to be part. So it's the same way. Nobody saw themselves of the boundaries that were created after World War II. They saw them ethnically. I look like and I sound like and I speak Uzbeki. I look like, I sound like, and I speak Pashtun. I look like and I sound like I'm a Harap, right? So all of them identified passionately with what they were, but they all had a common thread of an enemy, and that was the oppression of the Taliban.
And so that was one of my other questions, is what was really driving their willingness to fight? And because you hear stories about how we provided rucksacks full of money and all of those other things, but having been there and shared space with them, what was their real motivation for fighting?
So money is a tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
Consider just inventory. What will money do? You can't eat it. I've seen an Afghan take a bite of it and go, what am I going to do with $100 bill? Right? So to encourage somebody to fight, right? A commander knows he needs resources and recruiting. So money became a tool for them to go into hawalas and to transfer to their own cash, to then buy supplies and goods. Individual commanders worried about getting enough recruitment because wintertime was coming and soldiers needed to go home to tend to their families. So now we had to inherit the family problem. We had to supply foods, right? Blankets. Most of them had flip-flops. Wintertime was coming. Then we had to have lethal aid. How do you train, equip, and advise a 19th century outfit that most of them had lever action and bolt action infield rifles, maybe 10 rounds of AK-47 per man. All of that immediately within the first week had us realize the logistical challenge, because the winning partner came very quickly. They saw, and their leaders told them, America is here. They have planes and bombs and tanks that will take on the Taliban, and we need to be the soldiers for Allah on the ground. Americans can't fight for you. We have to fight for ourselves. And that was the central theme for at least the first 7 months. It was all Afghan.
So what role do you think, or do you believe that they saw you in your presence there? What role did you play for them?
So, and once again, your 7 phases of unconventional warfare is, once you have to have confidence targets. You have to have a demonstration of power. And the very first thing, as we rode up to the mountain fortress of Dostum, he was like, we wanted to verify where the Taliban were. We were also conscious of political and personal rivalries as they tried to assume who would be the commander of the resistance. So we were aware to be careful, vet and verify that what we're fighting is not personal vendettas. And we saw that in Iraq in 2004, if you think about it, is verifying that that's the Taliban and that's Al-Qaeda. So we actually, because of their traditions, they got on their radios and actually called each other. Right. And had a simple civil conversation of, are we going to have a battle today? And it was like, what? And for them, they would exchange family members. Okay, I'm going to attack you tomorrow, send my cousins, and tell me who I got to send. Oh, Bob and Bill, I'll send them down the hill. And then it became this opportunity. These two sides have been entrenched in a stalemate, whereas the Taliban had used all the major roads and had old military Soviet bunkers, and the Mujahideen were up in high mountain where the guns couldn't articulate or artillery couldn't really pinpoint. So the first thing we did, which was very new at the time, is, remember, GPSs were new, right? To the part where you could give a Garmin to your host nation and let them ride up and get a closer, grid. Laser guided designators at the time. All of this 21st century satellite communications was all new. And when we introduced it to the battlefield, we actually lased our very first bunker. We called in a strike. We pointed for the Mujahideen fighters to watch what was going to happen. And all of a sudden, we were about 100 meters off, missed the bunker. But the Mujahideen fighters, that is the closest they have ever been in the 10 years they had been fighting to ever reach that bunker. They immediately hooped and hollered, and they were so joyous. Actually, they thought we were gods of thunder and we could point and lightning bolts would shoot out and explode at the enemy. That's how simple the Mujahideen fighters were. But that showed we now had a way to break the stalemate of Afghanistan, and the commanders immediately said, we got to charge. That's it.
So I'm really interested then, when you think about the dilemma, the paradox of some of the most technologically advanced human beings in the history of mankind that are dealing with, 19th century folks at best. What kind of challenges come with trying to build relationships with people that are so different from each other, both from what your perspective of the way they responded and then the way that you responded and having a chance to interact with a different type of person?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use history again. In Lewis and Clark, you had Westerners that were, 5'7", 5'8", and you had Indians that were a different complexity, and they had dietary differences. We, on average, were 220 pounds of fit American tactical athlete that digested massive amounts of protein. The Afghan was on average 5'4" and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, and they carried a rusty AK, maybe a magazine, and they ate, a handful of rice a day. So immediately you have this cultural difference, the way you eat, how do you posture yourself, what you carried, that we had to leave behind a lot of our technology, because if they saw it, they said, well, why don't you give me that? Right? Whereas we're trying to make them fight as best as they can with what they have. All they want is everything we have on. Just give us all of that. That's all we need to be super soldiers. And so we actually had to hide and cache a lot of our items and start to dress and appear like they did. We had to start carrying a rifle like they did. So they felt we were shared sacrifice. Okay. We ate with them. We slept with them, right? We treated each other's wounded together. We repaired each other's, services and vehicles and whatnot. You have to get to their level for them to truly feel that you're part of the tribe. And then they would fight to the death for you.
That's a fascinating point. And I want to see what your thoughts are based on that experience. And then 20 years later, where we've emerged over a certain amount of time. And this is just, Joe asking Scott here, what are your thoughts on kind of where we started and where we are now?
Yeah, 2011. So after Afghanistan, I didn't go back, right? I went into Iraq and 5th Group focused mostly in Iraq and then Africa. I spent a lot of time with foreign fighters in Africa. So I went back actually as a civilian, one of the counterinsurgency advisors for General Petraeus and General Allen at the time. It was a small group of graybeards that would go, in and out of meetings and technology introductions and talk to old Mujahideen commanders. And we really had, full access. And when I saw the amount of technology on the battlefield that soldiers are relying on, it became so overwhelming that they lost the art of the human connection. If I would talk to an Afghan soldier, he would tell me everything. He'd know who the Taliban leader is, what time they placed bombs, everything. You'd go talk to the young lieutenant, had no clue. It didn't show up in a sit rep, right? So we lost this simple art of small human interactions, engagements that enabled those people that 100% knew the culture, the terrain, the influencers, the natural capabilities of somebody that was a Taliban that probably wasn't a Taliban, right? A card-carrying Taliban member. They were just paid that week to shoot at some Americans. So it was in 10 years we had done such a dramatic. Fast forward to today, we try to make a model of American military capabilities that became unsustainable, right? Just the logistical, how to order parts for vehicles, the POL requirements. We saw suddenly when we pulled the contractor support mechanism out that the Afghan military can no longer service some of the more technological air platforms or ISR platforms, and it began to collapse to what it should have been, right? Just a basic force that could counter Taliban.
I'm really excited about that because one of the things that we try to explore quite a bit is the relationship in special operations between technology and the actual operation environment, right? What relationship do we have with technology? And I think it's interesting to see a narrative where technology sometimes gets pushed out front too far. So what kind of things do you think we can do to continue to hold on to the lessons on the relational side? Or what can we do to regain maybe what was lost from when you started?
So we all remember Star Trek growing up, right? And James Kirk that had phasers and tricorders and he could, beam in and out. But remember, the Federation mission was not to disturb the culture of the people he went to, not to expose them to the things they can't have organically, right? We forgot to remember all we wanted to do was break the stalemate that the Taliban had militarily with the Soviet armor and equipment. That was the edge that gave them political and control over that society. We broke that with a little bit of support through close air support, right? And a little bit of command and control coordination. Then the momentum shifted. Remember, in 90 days, we had overtaken Afghanistan with less than 250 special operators. How did you do that? Because in Afghanistan, the winning side wins. If they see momentum has changed, they all change instantly. It's part of the survival culture. We were doing battles with the Taliban. We would call them Taliban. They're like, no, they're just villagers from the other village. And as soon as they call them in the morning, they say, do you want to fight or surrender? Well, we'll surrender. You're winning. And that was it. They now joined the ranks. So that was their culture. And I think we forgot, and we're so surprised how fast Afghan fell. But if you look at throughout their history, it has done it multiple times. Afghans will switch sides, whatever the strength and power is.
So I've seen personally and experienced it, and in some of my dissertation work, it confirmed that other people also participated in this, but the use of kind of disparaging comments, disparaging terms in our interaction with the Afghans, especially as we stayed there longer and longer and longer. What are your thoughts about that, the prevalence of us doing that and how it might have an effect on our ability to build relationships?
I saw it it started with a culture of special operations where it was built into us to make friends, you know what I mean, at human levels, right? People fight for each other, okay, not for countries or organizations. Remember that. I also have seen young 22-year-old 82nd men berate and tell them, what idiots and how stupid they are. Can't you get this? And remember, Afghans are traditionally very proud, simple people, right? Honor and esteem, right? Shame. These are all tribal subsets, Pashtun Wali, the Honor and Justice Society. That drives 100% of their culture and their mindset. So if you embarrass somebody, if you degrade and take their power status away from their family, it's like calling you a chicken in an old Western, right? They'll carry that until they get revenge. And that's where you see a lot of blue on green activities come from. When it's fully investigated, it came down to a set of personal interaction incidents.
Which is fascinating because that means that it's really not infiltration from the Taliban or some sort of adversarial action. It's essentially our own failure. And
it comes from, yes, the Taliban started using that as a tool because suicide bombings were becoming ineffective, right? And in Afghanistan, it wasn't their culture for suicide. If you look at the history of suicide bombings, they came from, students pulled from other areas. But where did this blue on green phenomena come from? It came from atrocities. It came from perceived grievances. And the Taliban, each time after we would leave after a mission in a village and say, see, I told you so. They are not with you. They do not understand you. We are here for you. And we lost the human narrative, and the government was absolutely nascent in these areas that the Taliban filled.
I tend to agree with you 100% on that. And it's just great to hear somebody from the very beginning be able to talk about how we were at a position then that we might not be at now. What do you think the challenges are then if we were to start the clock over?
Yeah.
And I was able to like climb into your head, pull out all sorts of lessons learned. What would be some of the big challenges if we were to start this all over again, and how we would build and then sustain relationships for long periods of time?
Number one is know when to leave, right? In Pashtun-Wali, you are greeted as a guest. That's why Taliban took care of Al-Qaeda and fought for them. Well, they took care of Americans, but then we overstayed. Past what we told them we were there for, revenge of 9/11, not to build a better nation, to put in a fiber network, to explore mineral wealth. It was to seek. So we could have left literally early on and given them some kind of capable security structure, and they had natural tribal structures that would handle it. It would have been ugly on our terms that we've seen, but it would have went back to another, I always say Afghan needs another 200 years in the oven, right? They're not quite up to the level of modern commerce, democracy, negotiations. We were training security forces by January of 2002. It was the last phase in the 7 phases of unconventional warfare, right? Is turn in from the militias, create some kind of government security force structure, turn in the arms to them. We had done all of that. Picture perfect following of doctrine. And then we moved on. And I think we turned our attention elsewhere.
So now I want to talk about not so much the fighters you were working with and the relationship you built with them, but now let's talk about the population that they come from, right? The simple Afghan person. And, I remember my experience in 2004 as an ODA commander in Coast. That was my area. And one of the first opportunities we had, we rode way out as far as we could get in our multiple GMV patrol. And the first village we found that we thought was like remote enough for it to be exciting, the village elder comes out and he started speaking Russian to us. Yeah. And we thought that was very fascinating that our interpreter was like, hey man, I don't understand this guy. And it was because he was speaking Russian. And his thing was, hey, the last guy I saw that looked like you was Russian. Yeah. So they have we think of the population oftentimes as a homogenous thing, right? An American's an American, but we also know that's not true. And it's the same thing when we think of the Afghan. So talk a little bit to us about the Afghan as a population, as a person, as those kind of people in different communities, and what the world looks like from their perspective.
Right. So take the military hat off and think human-to-human connectivity. Afghanistan is divided by the Hindu Kush, right? North and south. On the west, you have more desert, arid conditions. You're fighting over some water control rights, and it has some basic subsistence farming. And opium is this miracle plant that grows in any environment, and you could turn it into cash, just like whiskey and moonshine did for American farmers back in the day. Then you have population centers. You had Mazar Sharif in the north that had airports. You had Kandahar that had, was built by Westerners. And then you had Kabul, which was this metropolis, which you had banking institutions and traditional things. So that is what the landscape was. Well, let's not forget that most Afghans never traveled more than 2 to 3 miles outside their village their entire lifetime. 90% of the population is basically functionally illiterate, right? There was not cell phones at the time. So what was communication? Word of mouth, storytelling. Unfortunately, the 10 years of Soviet war had killed a lot of this mid-level youth, right, 23 to 30, that now was 50 to 60. So we have population age gaps in Afghanistan. Not every old guy is the tribal elder and has influence. So when you look at the people themselves, their husbands, they want to have families, they want to see their daughters, excel and become bright and beautiful. They just wanted to fly a kite. That was the national hobby for youth. And all of that was wiped away by one element using military force to dominate their religious views. And that's what, once again, turned everybody sour. They don't want your culture. They want their culture.
So if we look at, there's arguments out there that whenever we sit down and have tea with a person in Afghanistan, that we're essentially making an argument. And that argument is, we would like for you to choose to support us as opposed to choose to support the Taliban. What are your thoughts on that kind of bargain that we're making, and what kind of things can we do as Americans in the future to try to win that narrative?
I think, you now hear this Taliban fable, which isn't a Taliban fable, right? Is, you have all the watches, but we have all the time, because they are from that community. We need to learn to let it go back to what that population accepts, right? The light touch approach, Lawrence of Arabia-esque, right? One enabled commander, small teams of 3, 5, 10. When we first went in, a major was in charge of Kandahar, the city. He was the mayor, the fire department, the marshal. He was the light touch of America to let them use their mechanisms of government. And then we began to insert higher levels, right? You need to talk to me now. Okay, you need to talk to the USAID. Don't talk to me about USA. So we began to impose our structure into Afghan ways of life, not only at the village level, but at their regional district and their capital structure. And now the sad part is I had colonels from the Field Artillery Regiment now running district political, negotiations for power sharing, right? We've asked our young men and women to fill roles that were never trained or competent or capable of doing into Afghanistan.
So I think that makes another great point, Scott. What experiences in education did you have at the time that you were a Green Beret? Because frankly, for our audience, every generation of Green Berets is a little bit different. So for instance, 9/11 was my first day of SFAS.
Okay.
So I come from an environment where my first day on a team was well into this. And so what were the experiences and educational experiences, I guess, that helped you get to where you were able to do this? And what kind of things can we do, or maybe reinvent, dust off, reuse, or bring back, or, what do you think we need to do moving forward?
Well, I think and we may have gotten away by a little bit, is Green Berets and SOF at the time, not the SEALs as much, not, Delta or the Rangers or any of these other, operators, is we would do training exercises, and let's just say Kuwait, right? Where you would do security force assistance, you would train them on basic combat capabilities, but then they would take you out on Thursday night into Kuwait City. And you would go to, a festival or some kind of cultural environment event. I remember my very first Special Forces teams are the ones that worked with the Kuwaiti underground during the invasion. And we would go to the palace because the Sun ran the underground. And so we would do heads of states-like activities as young Green Berets that weren't from the embassy, weren't part of any of our other agencies. It was personal relationships. We would go into Africa, and we had take doctors and vets in the northern part of Kenya because the Somalis were coming over and doing cattle rustling on these very primitive tribes that only had spears, literally could only defend themselves against AK-40s with spears. But we needed to treat the cattle and the villagers. So you learn the patience of conversations, right? It's not retreating back to your cardboard box or your Connex, right? And maybe firing an email off to a loved one or shaking down your gear. We literally lived for months on end with them. Now, the command didn't like it when we come back unshaven with our shorts, you know, BDUs cut off into shorts because it was hot. There's the rogueness of discipline that, you know, is the fantasy of being in special forces, but it began the way that you integrate. And it became very hard to leave. You know, how many stories have we heard with Jim Gant and others where we romanticize living in the village with the villagers, but then you have, you know, this sense of going rogue and you're unrestrained. You know, it's a fine line that we ask our operators to do. Hopefully I answered that. I kind of went all over the place.
I think so, but and that's great because we have to cover quite a bit. And, you know, we're talking about 20 years of experiences here. One of the other things that I think is interesting too is a difference from an American perspective of the person on the ground who's actually doing this work, and then all of those leaders stacked above them. And you talked about leaders from, you know, from other regiments, from the conventional general purpose forces. But we also have, you know, different levels inside the Special Forces Regiment of leaders at different levels. And so I wonder what your thoughts were on how maybe our identity is as partner force leaders, whether that's just the realm of the people on the teams, or if it's something that maybe we should all think of ourselves as participating in from the top to the bottom, so that we have a better understanding and maybe a better respect for the challenges that we're experiencing. So maybe if I'm at the embassy, you should have an understanding of what I'm going through, and then I need to have that same understanding. And since you lived it at the very beginning, maybe you can expand on that.
So there's a couple transition points. Early on, it was a captain and a team sergeant was really America's representative along with an agency persons. And their ability really was to feed the intelligence and information cycle, right? They weren't there to broker relationships like Green Berets are. After about the third or fourth week, when combat became so successful and the elements grew, we went from maybe 300 horsemen the first week to a 3,500 person cavalry and 1,000 infantry fighters. It was determined that the next level of a commander needed to come in. Well, that's the military way of thinking, right? So now it's all of a sudden, don't listen to the captain anymore. Here's a new person. You need to follow directions from them. Would I like the captain, right? I got everything I needed. And it became disconnected at some of these mid-level relationships, right? And then it went to even further levels. A colonel came in. Now it became a two-star, became the overall commander on the ground in January, February, and it was like, so where is Mr. Bob? Right. And where is John? So we confused our own partners on the structure early on as we introduced, you know, this general needs to be with that general. And we abandoned those relationships that were more influential than command strengths.
Do you think then that there might be room for an educational experience for more senior folks beyond Rob and Sage, which for our listeners that don't know is the culminating exercise where we simulate doing this in North Carolina? Is maybe this something where we need to come back and do it again at higher levels?
British, we have foreign area officers, right? We have this kind of mid-career progression that we need to get back. You know, I've been on missions where there's only 3 of us in Yemen. Right? Unheard of, right? Why isn't the entire team there? Why isn't this larger staff and function? Whereas the British and the SAS, what was unique about the teams in the early days, not only did we start off with 12, the day after we broke down to 6. Within a week, we were 3. You know what I mean? And I don't know if we've learned that America can operate in small, effective diplomat warrior teams that are enabled by the mechanism of supply and logistics, right? So Lawrence Arabia, once again, was a small one-person, two-person command structure that then trained, equipped, and fought them. Early on, one ODA broke down to two separate teams that broke down to three teams that were hundreds of miles apart, and they were highly effective. We forgot the ability to downsize and create expeditionary warriors that is technology enabled, trusted, and resource supplied.
Yeah, I saw a huge difference just from 2004 and then coming back to around the 2010 timeframe with teams that were broken up into smaller units where you would have two NCOs from a detachment that had their own company, and they would train and lead them, to 6 years, 7 years later, coming back. And then when I would go around the battlefield and get a chance to see other teams all together, the teams were all together. And, you know, same regiment, same folks, same processes. You know, what do you think drives or allows, facilitates this change over time?
I think, you know, you build something that mirrors yourself, right? I think we did it in Iraq as well. I worked early on with the Peshmerga Guard, which was just a small cadre of very competent, capable people, to then the Iraqi Counterterrorism Force, to then the 36th Commando, and then into Iraqi National Forces. It just got larger each rotation. And the bad part about our teams is we never went back to the same place. I think we shook the snow globe and we assigned randomly teams and groups into new areas without a thought of where was your area of expertise? Okay, go exactly back there. And in Vietnam, the ODA designation stayed in that district, that area. They would rotate out individuals, but always keep the core. And it was the same thing with 5th Special Forces Group. The flagpole was there. And why was that? Because personal relationships, situational and environment awareness, we've lost it. We've been there for 20 years and collectively don't know what's going on in Afghanistan.
So it's one of those things that's uncomfortable, but we can't have an interesting conversation about Afghanistan without talking about what's happened in the last 2 weeks. Talk to me a little bit about your feelings about that, having been there at the beginning, where they are now, given all of the things that we've covered already. And what do you think would be, if you were king for a day, what would you change about how we train, prepare, educate ourselves to do this again somewhere else?
You know, this is now Scott the retired graybeard, right?
Correct. Yes.
But with influential friends, I'm, you know, familiar with General Miller. I served under him. I know his leadership style. I admire him to death. From the agency side to the Department of State side, I think, where was the collapse? Number one, the collapse was in the middle. We tried to make a mirrored, sustainable military force like America, which is only like America. It's nowhere does it exist anywhere else, right? Britain is completely different, okay? That was number one. Number two is this false expectation that Afghanistan could give them the one thing that always won, which is close air support. It's such a regionally hostile area that the Taliban were picking off checkpoint to checkpoint. It was a checkpoint to checkpoint war. And as soon as we collapsed our Green Berets, it was over, right? They no longer had a way to control, pay, supervise, you know, disparate security functions of Afghanistan. Then we didn't have that emergency plan that it was all going to go to hell. And special forces, you know, the PACE, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, the go to hell plan. I don't know if we collectively war gamed and thought the worst scenario plan, because it didn't happen. What we did see was veteran groups of former relationships begin to hear ground reports of commandos and all of these previous relationships that fought so hard for us now say, I can't fight anymore, we're done. I'm now fleeing. And we should have known that 2 months before this, because they were telling us back then the real truth.
Right.
And then finally, when we lost our key area, Bagram, that was a choice. I don't know if it was military or political, but it happened. Then as we began to disintegrate and we understood we probably couldn't control the embassy, it all broke out. And I think when the population flooded the airport, chaos ensued. There was no plan. Young sergeants again and young captains made real world decisions. And air crews, there was no plan to load that many people. So I think we need a good year or two to understand the end, because it's just as important as the beginning, because I think we lost it in the middle. Does that, you understand? You know what I mean? Why are we so successful with such a small force in the early days and so incompetent? I wouldn't say incompetent, but so caught off guard on the rapid de-acceleration of Afghanistan.
Well, and it's important that we have this conversation because the American strategy is strategic competition, where we're going to be competing with other strong state actors in developing countries and often tribal societies. So what are your thoughts then on lessons we can bring from Afghanistan, good and bad, that will help us in other contexts? So what travels, and maybe what gaps do we have and what we need to understand for the future? America
can defeat pieces of steel and maneuver, right? Our tanks are faster and can shoot further. Our submarines can last longer and fire better torpedoes. Our airplanes can fly. We dominate. But yet, if you look at our current focus, our nation states of China, of Russia, and North Korea, they're all conventionally minded pieces of steel. And where is our conversation about proxy, right? Iran using Hezbollah, other ISI and using the Taliban, right? Are we ready and competent as an army and a military and as our intelligence still just as active, or have they shifted to, once again, the day before 9/11, worried about military maneuverability on nation state actors? Let's not forget, we were just defeated by the most, unorganized, militarily coherent, equipped force is what the world believes now. And guess what? Every third-rate dictator and actor is now emboldened to go to ground and just wait us out. Just wait us out. Fly to another country, fluff your bank account and fly back in and take over when the Americans get bored.
Well, I think that we do have this tendency to believe that time favors the strong state actor, which is typically the United States. And most of the social science will show you empirically that time favors the incumbent actor. And that's definitely something we need to work on trying to understand strategically. If you were king for a day, what would you change about the way that we train and prepare, if anything?
If I was king, I would ask where my other king from the State Department. I believe some failures rely on the other powers of the United States. We didn't really engage economically like we could have, right? We didn't engage in diplomacy and but picking the right diplomacy, right? Not elections as they are viewed for us, but how leaders are selected in their own cultures. I think we asked the military to be too much of everything. The military should break things, and the enemy should sue for peace immediately, and then the military should withdraw. There should be other elements of our U.S. government that has the expeditionary capability in less than stable environments to bring other things, because the American military now becomes a symbol for being attacked all over the country, right? So if you look at the Cobalt bombings, it was a symbology attack. It wasn't a strategic, capabilities attack. It was attacking. So our sailors and airmen and Marines all around the world now are even more vulnerable to some kind of symbolic attack, not from China, not from Russia, but from disparate groups. So king for a day, I would have left. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Afghanistan back together again. And you should have recognized that and left.
I definitely think there's an interesting discussion to be had about the Afghan identity and what it is and what it means. And having a conversation with one of my friends once, I was like, it would be like us asking to fight on behalf of North America. North America is a place and it exists and I can find it on the map, but I don't feel North American.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a pretty good example of maybe what we were asking them to fight on behalf of. It doesn't always resonate.
You know, once again, hindsight is very interesting. I don't know if American institutions and Department of Defense, you know, we fought the Vietnam War in Ranger School, you know, every year, right? A patrol base and a dog leg. And, you know, how are we going to teach our commanders and our decision makers and policy makers to look to the future instead of fighting the last war we had? You know, this last war showed us the reality that bombs, missiles, and technology doesn't win the war when it's a very tribal location in an austere, remote area. America needs to build that capacity and allow them to take charge of the warfighting efforts, not to let this side of the warfighting effort apply its rules to the other side. So you almost need a different kind of force and use it appropriately.
So we've had some discussions in the last year or so since I've been at the SOCOM level working as faculty at JSOU about the soft identity.
Yeah.
And so you started out clearly when the identity was about the relationships. We've had 20 years of changes. What are your thoughts on the soft identity now and where you think it should be and maybe some things we can do to correct or sustain, whatever your thoughts are?
I think we need to be less gladiators, more Ronins. And what I mean by that is we built some very capable niche units that had unlimited resources and assignments of intelligence and ISR capabilities that would lead to the satisfying, you know, conclusion of a kill. But we underinvested into elements in austere remote conditions that would stay there for months and years at a time, that were patient warrior diplomats and their career progressions as well, right? So where is the reward for being a gladiator, press, media, books, movies, versus the subtle diplomacy of a warrior diplomat? And are we encouraging that career progression and, you know, choosing that you know, style of war fighting equally? I don't think we are anymore. If you look at, go see a Green Beret, they're not Green Berets anymore. They're many execution, direct action, strategic reconnaissance. We've lost the prideful campfire warrior diplomacy.
I definitely think identity is a big part of that. When you look in the mirror, what do you see, right? And if you're a door kicker, then you see a door kicker looking back at you, and that shapes how you think.
I loved it when I was doing that. It was fun and exciting.
Yeah.
But I'm an older man now and I'm wiser.
We started out at our time, just anecdotally, starting out doing more of the door kicking and QRF things, and it was really exciting. And then it was a couple months into it, we had a chance to push ourselves out, find our own group of folks to work with day to day, and moved in with them and started doing this. So we had a chance to do both. And at first, some of the guys I worked with were a little bit disappointed. And after a short amount of time, everybody was like, this is really where it's at. This is where I feel, just like inherently inside me, this is where I feel the most Green Beret of the time that we spent there. So I think it's important to see both of those and then recognize the value of that oft underestimated part.
I think we haven't talked about the ugly, ugly, ugly gorilla in the room, and that's contractors.
Let's do it.
So, you know, contracting became this mercenary, right? It's funny to watch press and media call you a good contract, like a bad Taliban, good Taliban. You're a mercenary or you're contractor. Well, USAID is a contracting mechanism, right? They're mercenaries. Oh, they're not. We have a way to reevaluate our capability with graybeard. Somebody like myself that has 20 years of soft experience that could be combined with younger teams in these austere conditions. We're doing it now, right? But I don't know if we're reimagining using this soft for life concept, right? These people that are highly involved, intellectually, socially connected with agencies that have the respect of their junior peers, that then could be a graybeard in these environments and communities that could bring some strategic patience to these gray areas, right? We also have, 20 years of experience in ISR that, once again, we use sometimes contractors as fodder, so you don't have to report how many active duty guys are in the area. If you look at the casualty rate, though, for contractors, they became tremendous. They were all great Americans or patriots. So I think we need to also, in this conversation, talk about how Russia is now using Wagner Group, right? How these other Arab states now have proxy contractor elements of foreign soft and American soft. They are a new battlefield capability used by nefarious, prominent families, all of this other stuff. And I think America needs to get a hold of this new dynamic on the battlefield, because we're going to forget how influential and also how disruptive they were for ourselves and others too.
I think you bring up an interesting point, and it's almost that we're going back. When you think about kings and militaries that were built 1,000 years ago, it was often through the use of professional military corporation type folks, people that didn't really have a stake in that professional military. We've moved into this very expansive Westphalian state system. And at some levels, America represents kind of the farthest evolution of the Westphalian state system dominating power. But yet the world is going to continue to figure out how to adapt to those kind of threats. So sub-state, non-state, intrastate organizations are changing the game. The role that technology is playing with adversaries is changing the game. So I think you make some great points about just when we think we have it figured out, we have to recognize that what got us here isn't necessarily what's going to get us into the future.
9/11 was the most successful attack of any of our adversaries, and it wasn't a ballistic missile attack. It wasn't a traditional Japanese on Pearl Harbor attack. It was really a dispersed network of people that saw and used readily available things to attack the iconicness of America. So I feel that we're going to really slide backwards unless we reimagine, not only our conventional capabilities and technology, but really get out of this romance of war and get to the business of dirty warfare. And do we have the capability and mindset and the guts to fight it at a level that needs to be fought? I would love to see those conversations now occupy West Point. I'd like to see those intellectually occupy other traditional military think tanks, because it's uncomfortable and it's naughty. It's these things that don't fit in a professional military staff educational system, but it's what is happening currently in the world today.
I think you make a great point, and I'll tell a quick story. A couple of years ago, when my son was getting ready to be a freshman, I took him to West Point to take a tour, because I was a West Point guy. And as we were there walking around, I'm like, that's MacArthur, that's Eisenhower, and we're pointing out all of these well-known great leaders of conventional military thinking. And at some point, we come across the statue of a man named Sedgwick. Most people have never heard of Sedgwick. And what I knew about Sedgwick as a former cadet is that if you spin Sedgwick spurs, he had this on his statue, had spurs that you could spin. So that made it neat. And if you spun the spurs the night before you were taking a final, And if you were failing, then the tradition was that you would pass.
Yeah.
So that's all I knew about it. So I'm showing my kid this statue and I'm talking about the Spurs. But after I'd been showing him all of these great leaders, he's like, well, Dad, who's Sedgwick? And I thought, I really have no idea. Like, I went to this school and I had no idea who Sedgwick was. So of course, now I'm obligated to go look it up. And when I looked up General Sedgwick, I found that he was a general in the Civil War. And he's famous mostly for his last words, which were something to the effect of, what are you laying down for, boys? They couldn't hit an elephant from here. And I think about that all the time because at the time, the rifled barrel had come out. So weapons essentially went from shooting this far accurately to this far accurately. The old man on the battlefield, General Sedgwick, who had a lot of combat experience, he didn't know that, but the guys he was leading did. And I feel like that gap between what we need to know for the future and what the people that are living in that, in their prime know is huge. And I sometimes think that what we need to do is, try to figure out how to avoid being like Sedgwick in the future.
I think those are all vignettes and lessons. And do we propagate that through all levels of our military education, right? The mindset. Because the reality is in 20 years, right, we've asked artillerymen to be mayors and to be military police, right? Patrol cities and restore civil obedience. That's the reality of what we thought. Are we going to go right back to, rehearsing, large military maneuvers when are we prepared for the reality of the future? And are we giving ourselves intellectually the right vignettes to emphasize it? I can tell you today, when I go talk to new Green Berets, they had no clue about the origins and how successful we were, right? All they know is what their last battlefield was and what they're getting ready to deploy with and the technology they have today. So are we ready to capture this in an honest conversation that leads to leader development courses, Ranger school adaptations, all of these traditional things? Are we going to go back? Are we going to fight this war for 20 years? Or are we going to be ready for the next level? Those things interest me.
I think that's kind of the quintessential question. And I was fortunate enough about 10 years ago to take a really great class at the Naval Postgraduate School on the American way of war. And we started the Federalist Papers and then went all the way through to where we were at the time. And it was very interesting at the degree to which there's a pattern of learning things, especially about irregular type warfare, forgetting them to get reacquainted with conventional warfare, relearning the things that we lost. And sometimes I think about we're at an opportunity now to try to maybe stop that pattern. And we have to figure out ways to meaningfully capture these lessons learned and turn them into meaningful educational experiences that will change.
Look, and I always giggle at the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare that was established right at the beginning of the war because Churchill thought and felt he was being informed and influenced and guided by a traditional military mindset, right? And nobody was being clever. But he also put a pipe to him. It was the same thing with OSS, right? You needed to go outside the bounds, but you needed access to information. If you look at some recent conversations on how SOFs should report to each other, right? We still resist and accept or try to change how special operations and special operations funding and special operations missions are given the equal footing and ear of policy and decision makers. We're having the conversation now, right? And
Correct.
If we just learn that you can't make conventional unconventional, right? Then we need to have a competent, capable, full-time, unconventional element, not that is laid underneath a conventional set, because we just saw what happened, right?
One of the things that I think is problematic with that is that sometimes the the arrogance of special operations, if you will, can get it to where we're talking about being better or worse than the conventional force. And it's not really about being better. It's just about that we're different. And I think that that's what we need to capture is the necessity of a difference that drives the way we do business for strategic purposes.
Yeah, hubris and humiliation humbleness is needed. It's a cultural reason. I'm wiser and older and more mature than when I was a young, action-minded, action-filled guy. Maybe that's the part of the early thing. And as you get older, right, why can't a mid-career, end-of-career joint individual who's tired and patient and calmer go and flip into this new set, right? We're trying to create this career progression in a conventional set when we need, you know what I mean, this other level. We need a bright set of thinkers to think through that.
That definitely resonates. When I was an ODA commander, I was the youngest guy on my team. And now guys that age, I turned 30 in Afghanistan. So, and that was in 2005. So it's interesting to think about that. I was the youngest guy on my team then, and that's not really the case now because of the things that have changed. So I appreciate your time. I think we covered a lot of things that we get to think about and to celebrate the perspective of somebody who was there at the beginning of this last crazy 20 years that we've had. I think we got some things right. We got some things wrong. We talked about a lot of great things. And my only hope is that we continue to have more and more discussions like this so we can learn the right lessons and figure some things out and be able to use special operations effectively, build that strategic patience we're talking about so that we can advance American security in the future as part of strategic competition.
Yeah, I think we all need to own this, and we all need to be, let's be mindful of the current history, not the 100-year history, the 200-year history. We are now living in current history, and we should capture all of this.
One of the great things that I do think we do is that we have this, at least in the Special Forces Regiment, we have this, like you said, graybeard community. We have this like Senate that's outside of the chain of command that sits and thinks because of the Green Beret for Life idea. And so the work that you're doing and the conversations that you're having, and I like to think the stuff that I'm doing as well, all contributes to us learning and becoming a better, faster, more effective learning organization for the future.
I think you're absolutely right. Because the community is still so small, we have natural human interactions, whether it's memorials like the 9/11. I just saw the new 5th Group commander who was a young captain when I left, right, to come to the headquarters. So it's the same with your alumni with West Point, right? Alumni exist outside of officer channels. Let's not forget the senior enlisted, the enlisted alumni that has a treasure trove of information and can be an asset as well.
I think alumni is a great way to frame it. So I think we're at a point where we're out of time and we've said a lot. There's a lot to digest. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with you, Scott. Thank you for spending time with me, sharing all of this wisdom.
Yep.
And hopefully we all are getting a chance to learn from it.
Well, we'll have to.
I agree. We will.
Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure.